Ever wonder if your file is the right size? Ever wonder if you're using the right chainsaw file? Is it the right size? Does size really matter? Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of interesting engineers as well as technical folks in regards to saw chain. People like Rainer Glockley with Steel in Germany, Roger Simons with Steel USA, people like George Ruggles with Oregon saw chain, Glenn Lovell with Oregon. These people have shared a lot of information with me over the years, and a lot of it also came from Soren Erickson and other professional loggers and people operating chainsaws across the country that I came in contact with. So many times I am asked, and people say, that file size matters. And it does. You have a small chain like a 1/4 inch pitch or a low profile 3/8 or a 3/25 pitch. Too big of a file is going to cause an issue. But in reality, it's not the size of the file as much as it is where the file is positioned in the cutter. The saw chain tooth has 5 parts that we deal with in a lot of our programs, and in reality it's been that way since Joseph Cox designed this particular type back in the late 40s, early 50s. There's 5 parts that actually work. It works very similar to more or less a hand chiseling process. You have a depth gauge setting, which it takes how much or how thick the chip is going to be. You have a point or working corner that starts the process into the wood. Then you have a top plate which opens the width of the kerf as it's pulled in, and then also a side plate. The side plate really does the toughest work because it has to cross-cut the fibers. But the 5th part, which is underneath the top plate, is called the chisel angle. And this chisel angle really starts to scoop that chip out. Its angle determines how deep it's going to try to go into the fiber to the distance that the depth gauge allows it to go. So that's a very important part. And that is cut with the radius edge, the top radius edge of the file. You see, the side cutter of the file doesn't do as much as the chisel angle of the file. Using the model tooth, let's take a look at what the chisel angle does in position. On the model here, this is straight with just the depth gauge up against a flat surface. You can see the side plate angle that's there. Now from the chisel angle view of it, the position is fairly straight up and down. You can see the contour of the filed area. Now we lower the depth gauge some. You can see that the chisel angle pivots forward. It's just like a plow in the ground. It's going to go deeper, faster. Now with a little more, you can see now it's almost really straight up. Now even farther down. So the position of the file in the tooth and how it forms that C is also affected by the depth gauge setting as it's going into the wood. And also as the tooth pitches back, you can see I've raised the depth gauge just a little, and it changes to a thinner angle at the chisel angle. Now, these are all 3/8 chain, but different types. You can see the difference in the depth gauges. You can see as the radius of the side cutter. This has the Vanguard depth gauge. All of these are 3/8 full profile chains, but they have different design, different configurations. This one is a little more aggressive out of the box because of the side plate angle that's applied to it. As you round file it out, that's going to change. But we have to look at setting it up correctly, height of the file to the cutter, to be able to produce a smooth, fast cut. The depth gauge in this relationship to the chisel angle is so important to how the tooth cuts. Think about that as you apply pressure, it ends up riding against the bar rails. The tooth can't rock back and forth with the depth gauge. When you start to think about taking and having a loose chain, the tooth is going to rock back too far according to the depth gauge setting and the chisel angle that's filed. So it's so important that we look to see that everything is as close to design as can be.
It's important to how the diameter of the file fits into the tooth. I was told back years ago that about 1/5 of the diameter or radius of the file should actually be above the top plate if it's in the proper position. After that, it rides in an area here down to what they call the gullet of the tooth. But you know, that top radius of the file in this area is really what sets that angle of the chisel. And then the depth gauge determines also how that pitches to the wood. You know, people think about that the chain is riding against the bar rail. Actually, it's not. When that chain is cutting along, it's actually pulling into the wood and away from the bar rail. And at that point, it has to rock and roll back and forward and then tilt side to side to actually clear the chip. That's what that top plate does. It moves that over to the left and to the right, the two top plates of the cutters, to actually open the width of the curve to go against the vertical, and then the chisel angle takes that ribbon of wood out in between. The chip is generally the distance between two cutters. And so that's an important thing to think about also. But the chips range from about 25 thousandths of an inch up to about 35 thousandths of an inch, according to how much you've taken off this raker or depth gauge. But very important to think about as that's cutting, the angle of this, the radius of it, and the angle and radius that's taken on that chisel angle sets up how it's going to tilt into the wood. Vibrations can be set up. Reactive forces can be increased, not only kickback, but push back and pull in, where chainsaws are chattering in the kerf. A lot of that has to do with the depth gauge setting, but it's the relationship of that depth gauge working in conjunction with the chisel angle. Grinders and guides have a special place in really being able to produce when sharpening a chainsaw. But it still does the same thing as a round file. It's only up to the operator to really do it correctly. And you can see there's a lot of different styles of teeth. There's a lot of different styles of depth gauges. And all of these relate to the actual process. But there's guides like this that more or less take away some of the variables. This lays on top of the tooth. It takes and it's able to keep it from going too high or too low, but you have to have the right size file for that particular type of chain because it has to hold in a specific position. And that's the reason why a lot of people don't use guides. You'd rather just take the file and be able to hold that at the proper height. But you have to hold it there for it to be correct. Roller guides like this don't go around the file, but they hold them in position so they don't go too high or too low. And this one has a different progressive style of depth gauge plate. And so that makes a big difference in getting every tooth to take the same bite, no matter the height of the point and the diameter of the file in that cross section. Let's take a look at some different variables when looking with files, the size of the file, the position in the tooth, and how the tooth actually rocks and rolls. File size is important, but let's take a look and see how the file actually hits into the tooth, how it rests in the tooth. File size is important, but that position to set up the chisel angle is so important in relationship to the actual setting of the depth gauge. The depth gauge, the raker, the drag, whatever you want to call it, is one of the most critical. And the next is also chain tension. Chain tension determines how much movement the chain is going to take up and down, back and forward, side to side.
You know, when we start to think about they spend thousands and millions of dollars in design of these things that work in different types of wood, and you know, people talk about different types of wood. You can take a pine tree or an oak tree and go 10 miles down the road, same species, and it's going to be different. Sometimes just a few feet away, it'll be different because of wet or dry or situations of rock or sandy areas. All of that affects the density of the wood fiber. It's not the species, it's a specific tree. How green, how dry, how wet, all of these factors come into play that really determine how that tooth is going to approach that particular tooth, that particular wood. And so as it approaches that wood, we have to think about pressure. We have to think about against the depth gauge and the bar rail. We have to let the chain do its own cutting. But as we're filing and grinding, we must pretty much put that C in the picture. It can't be hooked forward too much because that's going to affect how the depth gauge approaches and supports. All of these things come into play. Everybody concentrates on the outside of the tooth, but the chisel angle and its relationship to the radius of the file is really the most important when we start to look at fast cutting, smooth cutting, and lower reactive forces.
Consider the file size. There's actually even a 1/8. There's 5/32, there's 7/32 of an inch, there's 3/16 of an inch, there's 13/64 of an inch. All of these different files are used in filing different teeth. And it has to do with the design of the tooth, the design of the depth gauge, and also how we hold those and place those files in that particular surface. I had George Ruggles. I was able to help with some testing on some chain. And we were taking and looking at some different situations at this new design. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Ruggles, how much money will you spend to be able to bring this to market? And he said, well, we'll probably have a couple $1 million in this. I said, that's kind of interesting because I see people all the time at that time take $1.50 file and try to change it all. And yes, files are more expensive nowadays than what they've ever been, but they still do the same thing. They only mimic what the operator is doing. So if we hold it too high, we may backslope. If we hold it too low, we may hook. And you can actually see, and hopefully you understand with the rest of this video, how that can actually work for you, but it can also work against you.